Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. So I'm going to have a guest on in a second. This is not a live, I've pre-recorded this with Talaria. I've talked to her previously about Russia's position in the UN being untenable and largely illegal and breaking all UN procedures. And we are going to build on that today. This has been recorded pretty much 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock at night for Talaria, so forgive her for that if necessary. But this is a fascinating dissection. So what we do is we are dissecting some of the arguments that are being presented that we should kind of ignore these issues with Russia's position in the UN, provided by a former UN legal expert, and with her own legal background, Talaria dissects these arguments and finds them completely wanting and indeed not fit for the pen of someone who is purporting to be a former UN legal expert. But what we do is we go in very fine detail, looking at some of his arguments and statements. So that's what we're doing here. It's this will appear live to you, as in I'm going to premiere it so you can have a live chat alongside, but we won't be there. We might be in a live chat to answer any questions, but hopefully you'll get something out of this. This is actually, I think, a really important form of attack against Russia that I think needs to gather momentum, and I think there does need to be a movement within the UN of countries that are going to challenge Russia's position in the UN, particularly on the Security Council. Anyway, over to the recording. Hello team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. So I'm joined today by Talaria, someone from New Zealand. I'll let her introduce herself more formally in a second, but someone with whom I've spoken before concerning this topic we're going to talk about today. And we're going to revisit the issue of Russia's place in the United Nations, on the Security Council, for example, talk about whether it's right to call a seat on the Security Council a permanent seat. Issues like this that pertain to what appears to be a rather large problem that has gone not unanswered, but people haven't really been asking the right questions about this for many decades, as to how Russia is in the United Nations and has the position it does. So Talaria, thank you so much for joining me. Do you want to just introduce yourself before we sort of delve into the topic today?
Yes, thanks for having me on. Now, I've been spending the last couple of years now looking into this topic, and amongst other things, looking at how Russia got into the United Nations. I've done several substats setting out exactly how it is not in the United Nations. I've prepared a petition. What I'm finding is there is massive resistance to dealing with the issue. And I believe that is coming from a handful of so-called Western experts who seem to be having a lot of influence on government, other experts, and the public, and have generally convinced everybody that nothing can be done about this. Now, there is an issue. It's not just that our United Nations, which is like NATO, except far, far more powerful, with very defined obligations to protect all countries, and we've got Russia in control of it, and stopping the rest of the world from doing anything. That's 143 countries have supported Ukraine, and I believe that most of the others actually in the vote abstained. They didn't vote in favour of Russia. In fact, I think about 2.4% of the countries in the world have actually voted supporting Russia. Russia is stopping the entire world from doing anything, and it is that power that is actually enabling Putin to invade and do a lot of other nasty stuff around the world, principally influencing countries and stopping people from stopping him. Without that veto, the UN could go in, it could instruct NATO, it could instruct other military alliances to act. It could get multinational forces from all over the world. It could introduce effective sanctions where the countries of the world were compelled to comply. Blockades, cutting off, for example, all communication facilities, satellite internet to Russia, to Korea, to its suppliers. The United Nations has massive power and it is being stopped. And once it is freed to be able to do that, Putin's power completely disappears. He's got nothing except the second best army in Russia, as he used to call it. He's got a bankrupt economy. He will have effective sanctions against him, and countries who break those sanctions can expect to be sanctioned themselves. So this is effective. It's not like the farce that is going on with the sanctions at the moment, where Russia's oil sales are sometimes higher than they were before the invasion.
Yeah, it certainly seems like the UN is somewhat impotent in order, in the way that it is dealing with Russia. And in fact, it is not dealing with Russia and what Russia is doing, and it is partly because Russia sits in a very privileged position on the UN. I know that there was an article that's part of your Substack. So you've written an awful lot of Substack pieces on this topic. On your Substack, Knowledge is Power, which I will show on the screen now. So here's one of them: a masterclass in sophistry, debunking Larry D. Johnson's claim that estoppel and latches protect the Kremlin imposter in the United Nations. So that's what we're going to be dealing with today. But we're going to rewind a little bit to go back to an article in the Chicago Tribune by Ian Hurd. I'm just going to read this out, if I may, to just give the audience a bit of a taster on this, and then we'll look at the critique to this by a chap called Larry Johnson, and then you will offer your own criticisms of that. But here's Ian Hurd's piece. Okay, so with a Russian invasion looming, the Ukrainian ambassador sat across from his Russian counterpart, his first chance to unload the frustrations and anxieties of a nation directly to its aggressor. He opened not with a complaint about shelling or a defense of sovereignty, but with a request that the United Nations release the legal memos from 1991 that permitted Russia to take over the Soviet Union's old seat at the Security Council. The apparently obscure reference, made even more arcane by the fact that everyone knows there are no memos, may have seemed to many observers an odd choice given the stakes of the moment, but it opened a diplomatic front in a war between Russia and Ukraine that may have some sting. Article 23 of the UN Charter lists the members of the Security Council. It says that France, the United Kingdom, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the Republic of China are its 5 permanent members. 2 of the 5 are problematic. The Republic of China is the name of the government of Taiwan, a distinct entity from the People's Republic of China, which has operated in the Council since 1971. The Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, and its territory and people broke into 15 new countries. Russia sits in the Soviet seat because it claimed to be the sole legal successor state of the Soviet Union, taking over all the old countries' obligations, debts, and privileges. It notified the UN Secretary General in a letter on December the 24th, 1991. The UN appears to have done nothing to investigate, corroborate, or think through its implications. It simply acquiesced. That's why the Ukrainian remark was cutting. There are no memos because no work was done. Other post-Soviet countries claimed to be either new states or reconstitutions of old ones that had been forcibly folded into the USSR. Some, including Armenia, applied and were admitted as new members. Ukraine was a founding member of the United Nations despite being part of the USSR, admitted along with the other founders in 1945 as a result of a deal between Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill in 1945. For the Russian government, its presence in the council is an unproblematic fact. It has enjoyed the privileges of permanent membership, including the veto, and few have objected. The UN didn't object in 1991 and hasn't since. And the inertial pressures of 20 years of getting on with things has helped Russia cement its position. 2 decades of practice has helped produce the fiction that Russia is a Security Council permanent member. So, Talaria, I think that's a quite a good introduction here into where we're at. Is there anything you wanted to add to Ian Hurd's position?
Yes, that strange comment by the representative for Ukraine that was requesting documents. He didn't know what he was requesting because nothing has ever been available. Nobody knows, at that time, nobody knew what had happened because all documentation was withheld. Now, there are very set procedures. There's been about 150 countries join the United Nations since the 51 founding members signed the Charter. There's a very, very defined procedure of circulation of documents, receiving applications in particular forms, and Russia is the only country that has not been through that procedure in the entire world. So nobody knew what had happened. There's a lot of emphasis on people not, or countries not objecting. Countries, I believe, were sitting there wondering what was going on and when they were going to be asked to vote on it. And that simply never happened. The documents, as at that time, of those, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Professor Hurd's article, were still not available. They turned up sometime between then and November of 2022. They're now on the internet, and what we've found out is that there's no mysterious case, there's no doubt at all anymore. There was simply a bald letter from Yeltsin, from President Boris Yeltsin, who was president of Russia at the time, announcing that Russia was continuing the USSR's memberships. No reason given, no claim to any right to do so, nothing. Simply the memberships are being continued. Now,
it's a bold assertion, really. It's just like, we are taking over. There you go. We are now the new version of the USSR, and we're not going to go through any of the normal procedures for new countries acceding to the United Nations.
Correct. Now, there's been some confusion caused, and that happened in Professor Hurd's article, where there's very, very clear law that has been defined in 1947 when Pakistan seceded from India. The General Assembly referred the question of succession for a legal opinion, or for a declaration of the law. The question is, what is the law that should apply to countries that are created out of division of member states? And the law was extremely clearly set out. It was firstly that, using the example of Pakistan and India, India had the membership, Pakistan broke away, the fact that India's borders changed and its constitution changed did not make any difference to its memberships. So constitution, borders can change as long as the country is there, it continues. This is where the continue word, it appears, came from. Russia's changed the meaning slightly so that a different country is continuing the memberships.
Yeah, I
They're
mean, the
very,
name's
very,
different. And
very
like
Russian, very Russian.
yeah. So, where India, you can make a pretty good case that there is a continuation of India, right? It's just had an area
Correct.
that succeeded out of it. Whereas the
Yeah,
Soviet Union, which is a union of all of these different republics and whatnot, has turned into all of those different republics, one of which is Russia,
yeah.
and Russia then takes on the continuation of takes on the mantle of the USSR and just assumes its role in the United Nations, which is not the same. There's not a parallel with India.
Correct. So, to use another example, if Scotland were to secede from the United Kingdom, that would be a change of boundaries. The country that leaves becomes a new country. The country that stays as the same country. So that was the first proposition in this very clear declaration of law. The second proposition was that in order for a country to lose or for membership rights to be extinguished, a country had to be to cease to exist and be recognised as such internationally. And the words of the provision were the memberships would thereby cease to exist. So nothing else needed to be done. If a country stopped existing, then the membership ceased to exist, and that's one of the very earliest laws that dates
That's
back to
really
Roman law.
explicit. That's really
Yeah,
explicit
it's
because
absolutely
the question
explicit.
is, does the USSR exist anymore? And like everyone would answer, no, it doesn't. And that kind of answers it. There you
Correct,
go.
correct.
Yeah.
So that's the two provisions for an existing member. Then you've got new members who come along, and so the second part, the second paragraph of that declaration of the law is that no new countries can claim membership of the United Nations just because they were part of the territory of a member state. So when Pakistan broke off, even though Pakistan was a part of India's territory and India was a member, Pakistan was considered a new state.
Mm.
So it had to apply for membership. And so what we have with Russia is with the USSR is we have a different situation from India. Because in India there was a continuing state. In Russia, they specifically stated that Russia ceased to exist.
A
There
USSR
was
ceased
no
to exist,
continuing state. Sorry, the USSR ceased to exist. Sorry, it's getting a bit late there. But yeah, so that's the difference, is that there were two treaties signed, the Belavesia Accord on the 8th of December 1991, and then the Alma Ata Protocols on the 21st of December 1991. Both of those were signed by all the existing members of the USSR, the second one, and stated in as many words, the USSR as a legal personality and a geopolitical reality ceases to exist. There is no way that it exists. Now, both of those documents were submitted to the United Nations and were circulated and accepted. So there you have the literal fulfillment of the requirement for the membership ceasing to exist.
So we had Ian Hurd there in that article presents a situation where a Ukrainian kind of hinted at this issue, and it gives us an indication that Russia's membership of the UN is problematic. So then you have this chap, Larry Johnson, who, as you put on your Substack, you've laid out his bio, served at the United Nations headquarters as the Assistant Secretary General for Legal Affairs. So you'd think this guy knows his legal stuff. Of course, you yourself have some legal background as well. He formerly served as a legal advisor of the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna and chef de cabinet office of the President of the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, The Hague. So he joined the United Nations Office of Legal Affairs in 1971 as an assistant legal officer in the Codification Division, and prior to his last posting at its headquarters, served as principal legal officer in the Office of the Legal Counsel. So this guy, Larry Johnson, then writes an article which you go through effectively line by line. So this is a really, really considerable article from Johnson. It's a very large article going through a number of different rabbit holes and different arguments. And you basically do a line by line analysis and criticism. I'm just going to read the conclusion before allowing you to go to town on this. So the conclusion of his article is, in conclusion, it is not worth diverting attention from the main goal of how the United Nations should react to this aggression by returning to the past. No one, including Ukraine, objected then. Indeed, Ukraine affirmatively supported it in a signed agreement. And it is 30 years too late to raise it now. So he's kind of saying, let's not litigate the past, let bygones be bygones and get on with, fresh diplomacy, I guess. But you would argue that A, he's not correct, I guess, and B, that this is a worthwhile pursuit for the rest of the United Nations to follow in trying to unseat Russia in order that they apply properly and therefore are not entitled to that permanent Security Council seat that gives them the veto. Is that a fair summation?
Yes. And no. This person appears to have very impressive credentials. I am a litigation lawyer who doesn't sit around in ivory towers saying things. Everything that I have checked his work up with is actual fact. And what I have found, there's actually only the last third of it that I deal with. The first part is sort of introductory, telling the people that the United Nations can't do anything. Now, this is critically important because, as I said, it's the difference between Ukraine having the support of the world and having the opportunity to actually have military support and proper sanctions and other support, or the United Nations doing what it's doing now, which is sitting there wasting people's money, doing reports on what it's not doing, what it's not fixing. This guy, there's only one reason you have a conclusion like that. It's if you want to keep Putin in the United Nations.
Right.
That's your starting point. So then we go through and we look at his arguments. So what I've done is I've marked in blue on the left where I have, and you'll see I've started at rabbit hole number 3, which is he's done 2 rabbit holes, which are, but he's immediately insulting about the Ukraine ambassador, putting him down. Then he says.
So the rabbit hole, let's read the rabbit hole here. The rabbit hole number 3, declare Russia is not a bona fide member of the organization, there having been no decision admitting it as a member after the demise of the USSR, which is the main crux of your position and what we've been talking about already.
Yeah, it's a trespasser. It's got absolutely no right to be there at all. Now, so then he's chat. I just want people to see the language. He's saying, oh, he's got an argument and he's presenting it like this silly person, and he's putting it down. But I must say that the Ukrainian permanent representative's argument was strange, because he seemed to be trying to get Russia to legitimize its membership, whether or not he. But of course, he didn't know whether it was legitimate or not at that time. Perhaps it's diplomatic speak. But other than that, he's completely correct. Russia does not have a membership. The requirements for basic membership were never fulfilled. And then I've put the documents here, which we went through in our last discussion, just at the bottom of the screen, which we can click on to enlarge those. And you've got Chapter 2, Membership, Article 4, and there's a decision of the General Assembly and a recommendation of the Security Council. And then we've got the requirements for that. So that hasn't been done. Then we've got the requirements for a country to have a veto. And we've got the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics there, and not Russia. Now, Republic of China, that's a quibble. That's like saying the United Kingdom, any country can change its name. So the name is not the important part. It's a red herring. If the United Kingdom wants to change its name to Great Britain, that is not going to affect its membership. So the Republic of China has changed its name to People's Republic, PRC. The USSR is different. It has ceased to exist. All of those other countries continue to exist. So that's where the Ukrainian representative, that's what he's trying to say. And immediately he's being put down by this guy. And he says he's gained some traction from commentators and even some academics. Now, there's remarkably little about this on the web. And I'm guessing that it's because this guy has been taken as an expert and nobody's actually been through what he's said. So for a start, he's saying it runs straight into what lawyers call lashes or estoppel. Now, lashes or estoppel are when you're tricked by somebody into giving up something or making your position worse. For example, if you're tricked into lending somebody your car or something, or something like that. This is not, this law is completely inapplicable here. Russia has sat on in a place where it's not allowed to, and nobody has made any representations to it that it's relied on, which is what estoppel is about. It's where if you rely on somebody, they can't change their mind. Russia told the UN what to do, not the other way around. So Russia doesn't, this is just chicanery. It's just made up law that doesn't apply. Where a victim is induced to do something by promise or representation, it's not available where the victim is in fact defrauding the other person, which is what Russia's doing. There was no promise by the members. They relied on Russia. Russia was not induced to act in any way by a promise from the members. It was Russia that dictated the action to the members. And again, they relied on Russia's lies, not the other way around. There also requires loss to be proved. Well, Russia's had an enormous amount of advantage. It hasn't suffered any loss. So, and then you have lashes, which is a claim of delay, which he's emphasised at the end of his article.
So is that a kind of statute? Is that sort of statute of limitations? Because sort of thing where he says, "Speak now or forever hold your peace." Problem. So he's saying that because no one spoke up about it then, you can't therefore litigate for that now.
That's not applicable in this area, and the resolution kicking out the Republic of China was not passed for 22 years.
Right.
Time has, it doesn't matter how long it lasts, if there's a violation of the United Nations Charter, the membership is entitled to correct it.
Right.
And it's simply a fact. Russia has never become a member. It remains a trespasser because there's no seat for it to occupy. The Soviet Union's membership ceased to exist. There isn't any seat. There's a lot of confusion that's caused deliberately, I believe, by people using the analogy of a seat in Parliament. So you have a seat where, which the seat remains, the person changes and they get there. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about something like your membership of an electoral roll. The country's memberships in the United Nations are like our memberships of our government's electoral roll. They're personal to us. They don't stay there after we stop existing.
Yeah, it's a really important point, because I've been victim of talking in these terms of there being a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Of course, that's incorrect. It's a permanent membership and of that country, and if that country ceases to exist, just like if I died, then my vote doesn't get passed on in my country to someone else. I don't pass it on to my child, who's 14 and can't vote. But that's kind of what sort of happened, which is that the seat was passed on to Russia, and that's the issue.
There wasn't a seat to pass on.
No, exactly.
To pass on. That's the argument. The argument is that there's a seat sitting there, and Russia's gone and sat in the seat. But no, there is no membership. So if we move on to the next point.
Just on this point here, like, it's interesting that you've pointed out some sloppy language. The issue for the uninitiated, says Johnson, is how can Russia be a member of the United Nations after the former USSR dissolved in December 1991, and other bits and pieces of the former Soviet Union had to apply and be admitted to membership? And you guys say bits and pieces. These are like republics.
This is a supposed legal opinion that everybody's relying on. This is just bizarre. It really is when you start looking at it from a legal point of view. So no, they all had to be, because that is what the law is. If you're not a member of the United Nations and you want to be a member, you have to apply. End of story. Like you do with your membership of the electoral roll. There's no automatic. There's no membership other than applying. So he said.
Well, I was going to say, and then he says, uses this word sneak as well. Like, his language is quite, I think, reflective of his position. He's almost derisory to the idea that Russia are not entitled to this membership, which I think is like you've set out already. It's fairly clear. I think this is kind of uncontroversial. It seems obviously the case, looking at the parallels and the precedents, that Russia are not entitled to that, and they've just adopted it. So he's like, how was it allowed to, scare quotes, sneak into the organization without following proper admission procedures, or even a resolution deciding it could continue the seat of former USSR? Note that, of course, the same might be said of Ukraine, says Johnson, to which you go, whoa, hang on, wait a second here, because you should know better than that, I presume.
Correct. There's what you do here. There's also a confusion because the actual Declaration of the Law, the 1947 Declaration of the Law, refers to new states because it envisages new states like Pakistan coming out of India. Whereas, in fact, of course, the USSR was 15 sovereign pre-existing states. So, for example, if Chechnya came out, that would be a new Russia. That would be a new state. But so what we have to differentiate with here is we just have to leave that new state out of the way and refer to memberships. So these 15 states have got together. They've said, all right, Russia can manage our international relations, manage our money, etc., but we are still separate states, and so they were named republics within the USSR. So when the USSR ceases to exist or they leave, they're still states. They're not technically new states. They're new in the eyes of the United Nations because they've never been members before. But what we've got is we've got Russia and Ukraine. Neither of them changes their status. They've basically changed their constitutions or whatever. Russia wasn't a member of the United Nations, and it's still not a member of the United Nations. Ukraine joined the United Nations, and it's still a member of the United Nations.
And it joined the United Nations, one presumes,
simple.
as part of the USSR, it would manage to join the United Nations.
It joined in its own right, and it was obviously had the capacity to do that. It had the personality in international law to join the United Nations.
So as you write here, the fact that that Ukraine left the USSR did not make it extinct, so that its UN membership expired. Leaving the USSR involved a change to Ukraine's constitution, specifically stated in law as declared in 1947 as not a cause for membership to expire. So it coming out of the USSR kind of almost like it reignited itself, it like resurrected itself as an independent state in the eyes of the rest of the world, but in the eyes of the UN, it already had presence within the UN, and so there was no real need to get it to accede to the UN.
That's right. It was the same state, the same as Russia was the same state. So here's the declaration, which you can read for yourself. So on the left-hand side in the pink, what are the legal rules? So that's just clarifying what the question was. That a state or states entering into international life through the division of a member state of the United Nations, what are the rules they should be subject to? And then moving over to the right-hand side, you have the outlined in green, the rule that applies to the USSR. The extinction of the state as a legal personality recognised in the international order must be shown before its rights and obligations can be considered thereby to have existed. Thereby means nothing else needs to happen. It's automatic. As soon as the state is extinct, recognised in the international order, they're gone.
Yeah.
And then you've got paragraph 2, the new state. And this is where if we look at new as in the eyes of the United Nations, there's an interesting case with Syria, where Syria was a foundation member of the United Nations, the same as Ukraine is. And what it did was it gave up its membership and amalgamated with another country into a federation. So they just had one membership.
Right, interesting.
And when that federation broke up, Syria reclaimed its original membership. And the correct procedure was followed there, which this is in stark contrast to what happened with Russia. Okay, so Syria comes back to the United Nations, says, okay, that didn't work out, I want my old membership back. It wrote a formal letter that was circulated around the membership, which the Russian letter wasn't. It was hidden. It was put on the agenda for a General Assembly meeting. It wasn't put on the wasn't put on the agenda for a Security Council meeting because this was not a question of granting membership. It was a question of approving Syria resuming its membership.
Yeah,
So
Russia never had a membership, so they can't assume their old membership because they never had one to begin with, and that's a fundamental difference.
That's the fundamental difference. So Syria, so this is the proper procedure. The request was made in writing. It was circulated to the members. It was put on the agenda for the General Assembly meeting of all the members. They all sat there. The president of the General Assembly said, well, I haven't had any objections to us granting, allowing Syria to resume its membership. So I'm going to adjourn this meeting to after lunch. And if anybody objects, they can come to me. And then the meeting's adjourned, it resumes. The president reports to the meeting that nobody has objected, and accordingly, Syria has its old membership back.
So that there's a procedure. Yeah.
That is the procedure that the United Nations invariably follows. And you'll see some documents down the bottom where everything gets circulated. Absolutely everything, except this letter, which was stuck in a bottom drawer somewhere and hidden. That's fraud. It's not accident. There is no other document that's been treated like that.
This is a letter from Boris Yeltsin. Is this
right,
what you're talking about?
That's Boris Yeltsin's letter, the letter from Russia.
And you're saying that this was not circulated, right? Okay.
That was not circulated. Wow. Every other document that you see on this, all of the documents, they have General Assembly or Security Council written at the top. They have a number stamped on them. They have a number stamped on the bottom of them, and they have distribution general or distribution whatever, which records exactly where they have gone to. This was not even date stamped, wasn't even receipted, and it was not even acknowledged as a United Nations document because it's not provided by a member.
And this is the assertion you were talking about earlier, which is, Boris Yeltsin saying, "I have the honor to inform you that the membership of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in the United Nations, including the Security Council, and in all other organs and organizations of the United Nations system, is continued," he says himself unilaterally, with the support of the states of the Commonwealth of Independent States by the Russian Federation, the RSFSR. In this connection, please use in the United Nations the name the Russian Federation in the place of the name the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The Russian Federation remains responsible in full for all the rights and obligations of the USSR under the UN Charter, including the financial obligations. Please accept this letter as constituting credentials to represent the Russian Federation in the UN organs for all those currently possessing the credentials of the representatives of the USSR and the UN. Respectfully, Boris Yeltsin. And you're saying that this was not circulated and actually was therefore not acted on, and no one got a chance to vote on this or put up any objection.
Nobody knew what had happened. In 2022, you've got the Ukraine representative saying, "Can we please have the documentation?" Nobody knew what had happened.
Wow. So then you go back to Larry Johnson here saying the Russians made a claim.
Right.
It was distributed to the entire membership.
Yeah. Now let's scroll back up there because each of his words is carefully chosen. So you've got, if we scroll up a little bit further, right. So there's the sneaking around. There could not have been more sneaking around. That phrase is the perfect description of what happened. On 24th of December, Christmas Eve, when everybody's taken off, a sneaky transaction was passed off as a change of name when a traitor USSR representative handed some letter from a non-member to the Secretary General, who hid the letter from the UN members for 32 years changed the USSR's nameplate and flag without its consent, and allowed a representative of a non-member to illegally participate. Now, the parallel for that is, okay, Palestine's not a member of the United Nations, right? Exactly the same as Russia is not a member of the United Nations. Now, what would we think if Palestine walks in there and says, I'm continuing America's veto, and I want you to change the name of America to Palestine?
Yeah. Obviously, that would be met with a bit of consternation.
That is precisely, without the slightest bit of difference, exactly what Russia has done. And the Secretary General, instead of saying piss off, excuse my French, there we are, two offensive things in one sentence, has obviously been complicit in this.
Yeah.
And has changed the nameplate without, and we go into, and he's accepted credentials of the USSR's ambassador. So he's allowed him to represent a non-member. Now, that he's literally not allowed to do that. The rules and the charter itself say that only members are allowed to be represented, and the Secretary General, is responsible for checking the credentials of members, and he cannot, and they must be nominated by the head of government, the head of state, or the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the member country. So USSR has not nominated this person. So the Secretary General has accepted the credentials of somebody who is not representing a member and is not entitled to be there. And this was just passed off as a pretense because the same person was there. No, everybody obviously got confused, waited for the Secretary General to do the normal procedure, and it's kind of drifted on. There was certainly no consent, but it's not up to members to say, oh, we have to have a vote. That the Secretary, I'd like to know how much the Secretary General is paid to do that. That is his job to do it.
Yeah, 33 years later, and we're still waiting for that procedure to kick in.
Let's have that vote now, shall we? That's what the petition is. It's saying, let's have that vote now.
So, and just to remind people, there is a petition that you've got going on change.org. So really like to get some traction with that. We go back to Larry Johnson's article. He then says the Russians made a claim, and just that small sentence you have an issue with.
Yeah, and I was hoping that you might have some of your expertise, your logical analysis expertise coming in at places here. He said it is continued. He hasn't said we have a right to it. We're the successor of the USSR. He's not stated a single reason why Russia should continue it. That's not the way you write a document to the United Nations claiming something.
I mean, this looks
like someone. It wasn't.
This looks like someone who really wants Russia to maintain their position or have their position maintained in the United Nations without anyone kicking up a fuss. He's just skirting over the arguments. He's not analysing them as you would expect someone with a legal background to do. And then he's just sucking in those Russian arguments or the Russian narrative here. And then with that is this expression of the Russian assertions, like the Russians made a claim. And as you say, no, the Russians made no claim at all. It eventuated after 32 years of the members trusting the Secretary General had acted properly. And there was not a single claim of any reason given as to why Russia should continue a membership which had ceased to exist, which had belonged to a completely different country. Yeltsin's letter simply stated Russia was continuing the membership of another country, which, if it still existed, didn't even consent. And when it ceased to exist, its memberships thereby ceased to exist, using reference to the legal jargon. There was a legal concept of continuing. It was invented out of nothing. There was no legal concept of continuing.
There is no such thing as continuing another country's membership. You continue your own membership, and it might have been used as slang. It's certainly not any legal term. So he's also making chicanery out of this, using magic, making new words up that simply have no legal meaning. So then he says this letter was distributed to the entire membership. That is a barefaced lie. They were never circulated to the members. They couldn't even get hold of the letter until November 2022. That is the first time anybody's seen it, outside of this guy probably, because he was in the legal department. Now, then I compare it with two letters. Belarus put in a letter at the same date. That's it there at the bottom of the screen. Click on that and have a look at what was done with that.
So this one, the General Assembly one just down here, this is the letter that Belarus then circulated. And you can see it's on the United Nations headed piece of paper for a start. Although the other one was a translation. This is also a translation, right?
Yep, that's a translation. You've got it. You see the translation just below the yellow highlighting there.
Yeah,
and the right.
And it's got a UN stamp as well, which is also worth noting.
So highlighted, you've got it. Yeah, you've got the distribution general. You've got the General Assembly written at the top. You've got the date it was distributed. You've got the translation and the original language. And then in the heading below that, you've got letter dated 24 December 1991 from the permanent representative of Belarus to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General. Okay, this is identical to the letter that Yeltsin delivered on the same day, except that it's the same date. And look at the different ways they've been treated. The Belarusian one has been indexed, put on the computer system, scanned, and is there for public usage. Now, the Belarusian letter was just saying that Belarus had left the USSR. Belarus was a member. It made no difference to any membership. So really, it was neither here nor there. But that's the level of documentation that's automatically distributed.
Yeah. So that's interesting difference. And then
you've got the one below it. Then we've got Serbia's claim, which was actually identical to Russia's one. And you can see what was done with that. This was done 3 months later, 4 months, May 1992. On 27th of April, they've written this letter saying, and rather than just saying we're continuing it, they have annexed a declaration from the member state that they have jointly signed with the member state, which actually authorises them to use its membership, if you like. They haven't left the state. They haven't left the Yugoslavia. They're still members, and they've gone about it the proper way. And the letter has been typed out, stamped. The annexes have been typed out and translated and circulated to the members. Now you can see the difference between what was done with Russian. It was hidden.
Yeah, big difference there. Yeah, you can definitely see that. So that's a really important component of the argument. And if Larry Johnson's saying, well, look, they've distributed this and therefore that's all good and well, actually you are presenting pretty decent evidence to suggest that actually no, it wasn't distributed. And it doesn't appear that anyone had read this Russian letter. It was smuggled out or sneaked out, you could say, as you did on the Christmas Eve, and that's a perfect ruse for hoodwinking, I think, the rest of the United Nations.
While the USSR was the president of the Security Council.
Right.
So we know that America, France, and UK were aware that this was going on. I don't know if they saw the letter or not, but there's a newspaper article saying that they complied, that they wanted it. They had actually been frightened into believing that if they didn't give Russia its this supposed seat, then if they had any problems, they'd lose their permanent memberships. It was just absolute classic Kremlin tricking, because as I've explained, they can't lose their memberships.
So was interesting. Does that mean that there was some public recognition that this had happened, this kind of sleight of hand had happened then
there
at
was
the time?
Two things. Yeah, there's two newspaper articles which I've actually screenshotted and put further down in this article. So we'll come to that. We're at the proper place. Whoops, we're going too fast because there was actually important
Well, I was
stuff
just
on.
saying
that. Oh, right.
Yeah.
Here we get to the crux of what happened. 3 countries apparently connived in the fraud and violation. And what we've got here is we've got highlighted in red at the top left. United States, Britain, and France are happy about Russia coming in. And when you read through it, you see that they've actually been tricked by Kremlin propaganda to say, oh, well, you'll, if Scotland succeeds, you'll lose your membership. I'm just finding the lack of rigor here absolutely excruciating. So if I went into a court with these sort of arguments, I wouldn't be allowed into another courtroom again. So it would just, and look, they've quoted half of that declaration of the law in that newspaper article, and that insert that I've put in there with the red and yellow, that's the half that they've left out. So
that's a bit of cherry picking from the article, but also this is indicating, in a sense, that that 3 nations of the US, Britain, and France are kind of complicit in Russia's assuming this permanent seat, if you like. I know I purposely used the wrong term there. So that actually, it's not just that the USSR, I guess, has hoodwinked the world, or USSR moving on to Russia's hoodwinked the world, but actually there's been a willingness from some of these other nations, and that could go to, to allow that to happen. That could go some way to explaining why nothing's happened about it since, because actually these 3 nations have been somewhat complicit.
Well, what we've got there is we haven't actually got, they're happy that that these other countries have supported the Russia having a Security Council seat. Whether it was going, you see, that was the 23rd of December, and the next day we've got a New York Times report, another New York Times report from Vorontsov saying the letter, they didn't need anything more than the letter, and nothing was going to be done. He actually admitted in that article that nobody had been notified effectively, and his credentials had been accepted on the 24th of December.
Because I was going to ask you actually what evidence you had that there was. I know there's a lack of evidence that it had been distributed, right? But of course, that is an argument from silence that can be problematic. Just because there's no evidence of it doesn't mean that it wasn't distributed. But if you then got someone claiming in a newspaper article contemporaneously that actually that it hadn't been distributed, then that gives you some evidence behind your claim.
He doesn't say it hasn't been distributed. What he says is that nothing more is needed besides just writing the letter. So in other words, it doesn't need to be distributed. And I've also got an email from the United Nations document service saying they don't have any record of it being distributed.
Right. Okay, that's good. That's good to know. Yeah, excellent. Just to clarify here, because this is something I've often talked about. An argument from silence can be valid, or use. It's a valid argument, and it can be used soundly, but it can also be unsound. So, for example, this is really important to your case here. Actually, if I was to come in and say, look, right, Talaria, you've just got back from holiday, and I say to you, oh, welcome home, and we live in this flat together, right? And I say there's been an earthquake that was like 8.5 on the Richter scale, and crazy time. So lucky you just missed it, and you're like, okay, I've not seen any evidence for that, and so therefore, okay, it still could have happened. So just because I know no evidence of this earthquake happening other than your claim, it doesn't mean it didn't happen. But the problem is, if you expect there 100% to be evidence and that evidence isn't there, then actually the lack of evidence is disconfirming. So, for example, if you then walk out the flat and walk around the neighborhood and no one else is talking about an earthquake, there are no damaged buildings, not even a broken window, there's nothing in the news, and you would absolutely expect there to be, then that is disconfirming evidence. So the lack of evidence is actually disconfirmatory of the claim, right?
Yeah.
So here, to take this back to what you were saying, is that, in every other incident, the document service from the UN would have evidence of these letters being distributed, and it would be written on a letter. So we can be pretty justified in thinking it wasn't distributed by looking at the circumstantial evidence of being released on the 24th of December. It's got no official letterhead. There's no distribution evidence. There's no stamp on the letter, and there is no evidence where you would absolutely expect there to be evidence from the documentation service of the UN. And so you put that all together, and I think we're well justified in believing that it wasn't distributed. Sorry to go on about that.
Yeah, no, that's clarified it a lot. There's also in my images Substack, there's a shot of the covering explanatory note when this letter finally came to light in 2022. I mean, the very fact that nobody knew about it is evidence that it wasn't distributed.
Yeah. That's another nugget to throw in as well.
If it was distributed, it would be in Ukraine's records.
Yeah,
they wouldn't have been asking for it.
And by the way, like Talaria has done such an immense amount of work here. I mean, can I just show you the audience just the extent of this? This is just an images Substack of all the images to support the case that Talaria is bringing here. And my goodness, I mean, just look at all of this. And that's just halfway down. I'm halfway down the page, right?
You can actually get it read to you. It takes 35 minutes, and it reads perfectly, and you will totally understand it if you just get it read out. Each picture has a very short, succinct
caption.
Step by step. It's taking you step by step through the legal process of what was supposed to happen and what didn't happen and what it means. So this explanatory note actually says it was never accepted as a United Nations document.
Right.
So it was never received as a United Nations document. They do say that. There's a table of contents at the top, which
explanatory note.
Yeah. Oh, there you are, right there. Yep. If you click on that, that should. Where is it? There it is, right there. Right there. Stop.
This small one. This one.
Oh, is that Gorbachev? There's. Oh no, that's that's the declaration. Where have we gone? I've forgotten there.
Ah, here it is. The letter does not appear to have been circulated to either the membership or the Security Council. And then, yeah, here we go. It was never
There it
accepted as
is.
a UN document.
And there you've got it written out by the library, by the United Nations on the website.
Yeah.
This material was not issued as a UN document. It wasn't.
There you go. Well, I mean, yeah. That. So if we go back to Larry Johnson. So what else do you want to say about Larry Johnson's article?
Well, we need to go through again what he said. There's on top of he then goes from there further and further into actual lies about the facts and actual lies about the law. Where are we? We're still on the images Substack, aren't we?
No, we're back on.
We're back on
the
there.
one.
Sorry, my eyesight's just about dead. I've been on the computer.
So he said
too long.
the Russians made a claim. It
Right,
was distributed to the entire membership.
It was a barefaced lie.
And there were opportunities for any member to speak up, question, object, comment, or make proposals or more. So, of course, if it wasn't distributed, then they can't do that. So
nobody knew what had happened. Nobody knew what had happened. Nobody could speak up. But what he does say further down is that people were asking questions and they were bullied. So that he does say. True, there's no positive decision taken on the issue. There was no pushback or challenge either. Now here's your Doris. Here's your Doris story. Okay. Doris has got burglars in her house, setting fire to it and beating her up, and she's too scared to say anything. Does that make what they're doing right?
That's a perfect analogy, and I'd love to bring in Doris into this. But yeah, absolutely right. It doesn't, it doesn't make it right that if there was no pushback. Yeah, because if we're looking back and saying right now,
specious arguments.
Yeah, if we're looking back now and saying right, these protocols should have been, carried out. This procedure should have been taken, and it wasn't taken. You can't just say, yeah, but there's no pushback. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Like if we're looking at what the legality of the situation is now, and then this was not fulfilling the criteria for for acceding to the UN and having that membership. So yeah, no pushback is not an argument.
No, they've got to comply with the law. So can you see how he's just making up chicanery and saying, oh, nobody objected, so therefore they're a member. It's just like, sorry, no, that doesn't. They didn't object because they didn't know what was going on. They trusted the Secretary General. And there's my Doris argument.
Yeah, good on you. Yeah, with no objection, the claim stood. It might have stood, but it doesn't mean it was justifiably standing.
But there wasn't any claim. They didn't say. He did not say Russia has a right. He didn't even say Russia has a right to the seat. He just said we're going to do it. And then he says it was a major subject behind closed doors. Well, that indicates that there was consternation going on. Obviously, but we don't know what was discussed. He's saying, they discussed it and they decided not to challenge it. Well, no. Obviously, the collapse of the Soviet Union was the subject of discussion. They're probably discussing what's going on, but you can't object to something that hasn't happened. As far as members were aware, nothing might happen. But again, I'm just rebutting or refuting, showing how ridiculous his specious arguments are about that.
And he goes on to say, but it was a major subject of discussion behind closed doors and in consultations, because that appears to be just a barefaced assertion there, a bold assertion, sorry. No government thought it advisable to openly challenge or question the claim or even discuss it publicly, which again doesn't make it right. Okay, just because no one had.
Well, they don't know that there was a claim. They don't know that there was a claim. They don't know that any decision had been made. All they know is that the same representative who is USSR is there and the nameplate's been changed to Russia, and they don't know how or why or what's been going on, and they're probably there is a provision in the credentials provisions where if the credentials are disputed, they get to sit and do their job as if they were accepted until a decision is made. So there's all this stuff already in the UN. But then it says Ukraine at the time supported Russia's holding the UN Security Council seat. Yes, but they didn't support them holding it without going through the proper procedures and being voted. They've signed a document, probably under extreme pressure from Russia. So perhaps they've said, oh, yeah, we'll sign it. There's no saying whether they expected Russia to be refused membership or what was anticipated.
Then he says, do you have that document at all, like the one that Ukraine signed?
Yeah, that's in the images. In the images. It just says we read it out in our previous discussion a year ago.
Right.
It says, we the countries Azerbaijan, blah blah blah, support the Russia and continuing the USSR's membership. That's all it says. About 3 lines.
And of course, that has no bearing on the legality of the process that has taken place. So
yeah,
it doesn't really matter what they support.
Yeah, I mean, they could support Palestine having America's vote.
Yeah,
it's completely meaningless. But notably lacking was any support from the USSR. That didn't agree, and they were still in existence then. And then he says, I was principal legal officer in the office of the legal counsel at the time. So he 99% likely knew what was going on, exactly what was going on. And
may therefore have been complicit himself, right?
Yeah. Well, he's certainly complicit now.
Yeah.
He's, instead of advancing legal arguments or anything, he's just grabbing all these straws. In 1991, it was Russia of Boris Yeltsin, not Vladimir Putin. And I've said, Boris Yeltsin was basically a lush with a well-known alcohol problem who'd just overthrown another a UN member state, leading a bankrupt mafia state, desperately mismanaged and corrupt, unstable, violent country with an unbroken history of extreme human rights abuses, economic malmanagement, invasions, and abuse of the United Nations veto. No country in their right mind would vote to give them control of the UN. That's why they didn't put it to the vote. That's why they took it out of the procedures and of the proper procedures and sneaked it in. He's saying, there's a beautiful quote there saying, if the 11 ex-Soviet states didn't object, who would object to Russia? When you consider that, it's just complete. It's like it's Kremlin black as white arguing. It's like just really messing your head around. So we've got. Then he says that America. He says that it's pretty obvious from the surrounding circumstances, from what I've got, and from Vorontsov's statement, because we've got an audio recording of that representative, that ambassador, actually saying what happened. So this guy is saying China agreed. Now, the newspaper article indicates that China didn't agree. And in fact, if it had gone to the Security Council resolution, China would have vetoed it. So he's actually lying about facts.
So, there's not a lot he's telling the truth about.
No. No.
Um,
And then he said it's in everyone's interest that the USSR be dissolved peacefully and orderly. Well, breaking the law and giving an illegal veto to Russia, a country with a history of abusing it, would be expected to have the opposite effect, and indeed it did. Russia immediately began abusing the veto. It started trying to take Crimea back in May of 1992. And Ukraine was complaining to the United Nations, and its complaints were ignored because
wow.
Russia was controlling it, and that's documented. I've got that in. That's in the notification one, but we won't go there. We can go through that another time. But there's
So
an
much
awful lot
detail
in
that
there.
you've
There's
compiled.
an
Yeah,
awful.
yeah,
Well, what I've done is I've just, and then he said the republics of the former USSR agreed to Russia maintaining the seat. No, they didn't. 1/4 of them didn't agree at all.
yeah.
So he said some of them. Um, and there's this beautiful quote. They agreed to Russia maintaining the seat. If they agreed, who would object? And I just say, what? On what grounds would anyone have objected to Russia continuing the seat of the USSR? What sort of legal argument is this? Covered above, bankrupt, dangerously unstable, got nukes, alcoholic ruler, riddled with corruption, unbroken history of abusing the veto, human rights abuses, aggression. They've killed. Stalin's got the second record in the world for the number of people that he that died. And then I've just pointed out there's only one reason that resolutions aren't tabled. That's because they're not going to pass. And then he says maybe to get rid of a veto, if so it was up to a member to speak up and make the case. No, it's not up to a member to enforce the United Nations Charter. That's the job of the Secretary General.
That's the infrastructure of the United Nations to do that. This is a really important point, though, you make there. That well, first of all, that actually there are plenty of grounds for objecting to Russia continuing the seat of the USSR. But actually, it's this point: the resolutions aren't passed. The reason that wasn't put, tabled as a motion is because one would assume it wouldn't have passed, right? So
Yeah, that's why it was
that,
hidden.
that's a really, I think, justifiable thesis there. That this was smuggled through because they were, well, there was a very high probability that they wouldn't be able to get Russia onto at least the Security Council. And so there's some complicity going on here from these other nations, I think, as well, for sure. But anyway, to carry on, he says later, I don't know if you want to pick this up.
Yeah, then you've got him fudging the concept of members were notified, which they weren't. Russia claimed it was not a successor state but a continuing state. Now that might have been part of the bullying that went on of individual members who are saying, hey, what's going on? When are we going to get a vote about this? Why is Russia sitting there? And they're told that there's some legality where Russia's not a successor state but a continuing state. And so they're going, oh, well, if the secretary says that's okay, then it must be okay. But again, he's just repeating over and over again the same lies. And then he's got, interestingly, one thing I didn't know was that the USSR's traitor ambassador turned up with a Russian flag at the same time as the letter. That's a bit presumptuous, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just like, and here we are. I mean, it's a fait accompli.
Exactly. The flag was replaced on the 28th of December while everyone was still away. So when they came
Wow.
back, it was fait accompli. And
Wow.
there's an article clipping that I've got there from the LA Times about how nobody turned up except Russian staff. Basically, there wasn't the normal fanfare when a flag's changed.
Really?
And then he says, The name happened to change. This is an illegal opinion. The
Just
name
like
happened
magic.
to change. Yeah. And I'm going, yeah, it just happened to change without the consent of its owner.
Unbelievable.
So, but this is the crux of it. This is really beautiful. So, what he's saying, he said the UN membership is being continued. He's focusing on this. He's kind of putting the succession thing aside and saying, no, Russia didn't inherit it. It's continuing it like it is the USSR. And so he's tried to stretch it again. Vorontsov said in his interviews that this was the idea of US lawyers, predecessors of Trump's ones. So they've come up with this idea of, instead of saying it's a succession, because Russia clearly didn't inherit anything from the USSR, they just say it was continuing. And then but this bit in the middle of the page, in the law of succession, Yeltsin was claiming that parts of the territory of his country, small problem, the USSR wasn't his country, it wasn't Russia's country, had separated. So parts of the territory of his country had separated. So he's saying the USSR is his country and other parts of it have separated, leaving behind the rump. Well, actually, small problem, Russia had separated. It was one of the first ones to leave. So
Wow.
do you see the complete sophistry that's going on
Yeah.
here?
And this
He's
goes back to
just
what we were originally talking
turning.
about with regard to like the whole idea of a nation dissolving. It's not that part of the nation has gone, you know, like Pakistan and India, like you said. It's back to that original point, which is this is a dissolution. I mean, everyone says the USSR dissolved, right? And you know, out of the USSR came these different nations, which if they previously had membership of the UN, like Ukraine, then okay, that was just resurrecting that, or that continued in a proper sense. But for Russia, there was no original membership of the UN, and so therefore they should have to go through this. They were the ones that came out first, you say. So actually, rather like Pakistan, they would have to then go and accede in a proper way, and they haven't done this. And it seems like Larry Johnson here is just fine with that.
He's just made a complete back to front. He's saying that all the other countries, all the other republics left and Russia stayed, whereas in fact Russia left while the USSR was still in existence and still using its membership.
Wow,
so Russia,
that's a massive point.
Russia was nothing to do with the USSR. It left, and the USSR continued in the United Nations, voting and exercising its membership.
Wow. And then just over a course of some time, it just suddenly like merged with Russia, and it became Russia for the purposes of the UN.
Yeah. Through Larry Johnson's magic wand.
Yeah. So is there anything?
Okay. Oh, there it is. Just off the top of that page there, we've got the just a little bit further up.
So the full sentence is he was claiming that parts of the territory of his country, says Johnson, had separated, leaving behind the rump, which continued the international legal personality of the former largest state, whose name happened to change as well, just by sheer cosmic chance. There you go.
This is the opinion that the Ukraine Ministry of Foreign Affairs is relying on and believing.
So that's not something we've talked about previously. So going back to this Larry Johnson article, you told me before we started recording that this is in two languages, one Ukrainian and one English, because actually this is a kind of a legal opinion.
It's specifically directed at putting off everybody and getting to the authorities, which has resulted in the reactions to me when I try to make the points that I have made there, that it's just complete lies. It's not even like arguable. The documented facts with screenshotted documents, which I have provided, saying they're actually lying. And our government are believing this and refusing to listen to me, and people are refusing to not signing the petition because they're saying it's hopeless because the UN has no guts anyway, but it has no guts because Russia is stopping it.
Yeah, we'll talk about what can be done about this. Hopefully concisely at the end. So is there anything else to go through with Larry Johnson's?
The guy's lying like a flatfish. So the same country, just smaller, Russian Federation, was the continuing state. No, Russia had left, whereas all the bits had spun off. So Russia was the bit that spun off, was the 4th out of 15. And so they were successor states. I don't know what he's talking about with the successor states. I have no idea what he's talking about successors.
Well, he's saying that the other ones. He's saying he's special pleading that every other state that goes. Well, every other state that spins off are successor states, but Russia is a continuing
technical
state.
Meaning. This is a technical meaning. There's no. What he's saying is meaningless. There was their emergent states. They haven't succeeded to anything. They agreed. They undertook the USSR's international obligations in the treaties. Nobody inherited anything from the USSR. And again, before that, on the 4th of December in the Moscow Treaty, dividing the USSR's debts and liabilities pro rata between them. There's no concept of anybody inheriting anything. They ended up with their territories, but they had to, and what was on their territories. But as far as any other aspects of the USSR, they had no rights at all.
Which is interesting because Yeltsin, in his letter, said that they were inheriting, that Russia, he just asserted that Russia was inheriting.
No, he didn't.
Oh, I thought that was on his letter.
No, this is the difficult part about it. No, he makes absolutely no claim at all. No claim to any right. No reason why the USSR's memberships haven't been extinguished by the law, which every single other country has complied with.
Right, this is what I was talking about. Actually, this is within the UN. Actually, not. Yeah, so this is different. The Russian Federation remains responsible in full for all the rights and obligations of the USSR under the UN Charter, including the financial obligations. That's to the UN.
Which means the word remains means that it has no obligations at all. The use of the word remains means that it has no obligations at all, has never had any obligations.
The way I understand that is that Russia just inherits the obligations to the UN, I guess, organizationally. Like its obligations to the UN, as in, I presume, payments or whatever. But whereas this back here is talking about the different member states within the USSR and that their own individual debts or whatever were apportioned pro rata, which is a completely different thing.
That Russia should have said that it undertook. There's actually a protocol, which was, I think, about 1948 as well, saying what applicant states had to say, and they had to make a specific declaration supporting the charter, and there's words that they needed to use. He didn't use those. He said it's continuing something that it's never existed before. So that's again, it's just the whole thing is put together in a very, very particular way, and then he goes back to Ukraine and Belarus. They were found. He says they were deemed to be founding members. Well, no, they were founding members. They signed it.
He goes on to say so he kind of papers over that the issue to do with Ukraine and Belarus. He says, they're founding members of the organization in 1945 for reasons not dealt with here. But yeah, he goes on. Are there any other sort of major points after this?
Well, then below there we get into he keeps expanding, saying how people were raising objections. Then he says that America appeared to be smacking countries down. That he says it's not for the Secretary General to decide what's a state and what isn't. So what he's saying is that the Secretary General couldn't decide that Russia wasn't the USSR, which again is that back to front.
But who then? I mean, it's
mirror
ridiculous.
arguing.
Who does decide? He's just saying it's not for the. It's not for. He's effectively saying it's not for the UN to decide who a UN state is. So what? I can just turn up and say I'm a state and send a letter in like Boris Yeltsin, and then
Not
so
quite.
there's a state of Jonathan M.S. Pierce. Like,
Yeah.
that seems to be like whose job is it then?
Well, what he's arguing, the answer to that is it's a question of law and fact. It's not a question. It's something that you go to court to determine. It's not something that you have votes from members on. Now, this was blatantly obvious that this was illegal. There is just not a shred of doubt that it was illegal. Everybody was there. They knew that Russia had left because Russia had filed
USSR had left
a document. Sorry. No, Russia had left the USSR.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
While the USSR was still in the United Nations, because Russia had filed a document in the United Nations saying we've left. That was the Belovezher Accord. So every single country in the world knew that. They had been circulated that document. They knew that Russia wasn't the USSR. And then he starts calling it a club. He's saying, it's up for the members, that's for the members of the club itself to determine whether a country's a state or whether it's a member. No, it's a question of law.
But also, even if you did grant him that, the members of the club didn't do that. In fact, no one cast any formal opinion on this. It was just so even his own argument doesn't really work. But you would contest his argument anyway. But anyway.
Yeah, well, that's fairly standard Kremlin procedure, isn't it? Arguing technique, argue conflicting things.
Yeah.
So, and then he says Perez de Cuellar was sent a note verbal to all members and other UN organisations circulating the Yeltsin letter. And I've got the official document, that's the email from the UN official document system saying we don't have any record of any of those, and then a couple of examples of notes verbals that they keep. And they're just on the most minor things. Like one of them was Japan's note verbal, which is indexed on the computer record saying, yes, we don't need to comply with the arms embargo against Serbia because we weren't sending them any arms anyway. That's the level
so if you're gonna have
detail that is recorded.
Yeah, if you're going to have a note verbal at all, it's going to be about this subject, right? So like whether a UN security member is actually a member.
There's a note verbal. The bottom one of those two with the blue stuff on it, that's a note verbal from Russia. I think it's on the 3rd of January, talking about the Yugoslavian war, just some blah, blah, blah stuff. That is the note verbal.
So there's no evidence for what he says. It looks like it's another.
Then you've got the letter. Then you've got the New York Times report from Vorontsov. The two pink parts on that, one on the left and one on the right. The one on the left says that that's dated the 25th of December. Says he's now been reaccredited. So that's been done. Another thing that Johnson says, he keeps on repeating, the Secretary General waited and looked to see if anybody was going to object. Well, here you have his accreditation the same day that the letter was submitted. And on the right-hand side at the very bottom, requires no further decisions from the Security Council.
And that's coming from Vorontsov
follows
himself, who is
follows automatically from today's letter. He's the president of the Security Council, and he's dealing with the Secretary General who's hidden the letter, binned it.
I love the use of the word assumption, because it really is assuming. You're just assuming it. You're not justifying it. You're just like, yeah.
Yes. So he's just said it follows automatically from the letter. Nothing more needs to be done. Then you've got just the record of the flag.
Yeah. So interesting. So any other points to Larry Johnson worthy of note?
Okay. He says he doesn't have any recollection of any legal opinion offered by that office. It's the first place that a letter like that would go to was the legal office. He would have seen it. But he said
does this pertain to criticisms or issues? This is pertaining to a legal opinion about the assumption of Russia,
about what needs to be done, what can be, what needs to be done, what's the protocol, what's the proper procedure,
which is him again admitting that there was no procedure. It was I don't have any recollection of any legal opinion. In other words,
he's distancing himself. He's covering his butt. And then he misses out on what have we got there? Nor I suspect, as any legal opinion would have provided confidentiality, I suspect it would have concluded it was a matter for the membership to react to the Russian claim as they deemed fit. So in other words, we'll just break the law and see if anybody complains. And then he's missed out the two most important and similar cases in this article. So he's covered the Indian one, and but sort of skipped over the fact that he's entirely omitted the fact that the USSR has been declared twice to be non-existent. He's just treated that as if it doesn't exist. So he's quoted this and then just said, Russia is continuing under the first part, rather than the USSR ceased to exist, and so did its membership. And then I've got the screenshot of the USSR ceasing to exist document. And then he's missed off the China case and the Serbia case. He said
so he's not really investigating this in the required detail with looking at sort of legal precedents. And when you also just looking at some of this language above, I suspect it would have concluded that it was a matter for the membership, blah, blah, blah. I suspect it would have. I mean, again, it's just like very vague and a lot of modality going on there. Like, I don't think that stands up particularly strongly.
This is a ridiculous argument. Here we've got requesting an advisory opinion from the ICJ. He's saying he's making all these suggestions to put people off the obvious. The members could have convened a special meeting. Well, that's the Secretary General's job. Or they could have applied to the ICJ. But then, if they applied to the ICJ, that would throw everybody into turmoil, because they wouldn't know what to do with Russia while the ICJ was determining whether it was a trespasser or not. It's just the most upside down reasoning. I mean, you don't not seek a legal opinion because you're a bit worried that people might get a bit disturbed by it during the meantime.
That's the International Court of Justice, which is one of the 6 organs of the UN, just to let you know what the ICJ is as the audience there.
And then he's got actually admits that members were basically being bullied and intimidated.
So he said, members said nothing at the first meetings at which the change was reflected. Although no objections or questions about the claim came in writing, the first time UN bodies met after the name change would offer an opportunity to raise the matter in a meeting. Any delegate could raise a point of order from the floor, asking what is the sign Russian Federation and who is sitting behind it. and thus opened up the issue for debate and discussion. The first meeting scheduled after the change were not in the General Assembly, but rather the Council. The Security Council met for the first time after the change, but it was the last day of the month, and which had heretofore been presided over that month by Ambassador Vorontsov as a USSR representative. On the 31st, however, he presided behind the Russian Federation nameplate. The meeting lasted 5 minutes, at which a resolution on Western Sahara was adopted unanimously. So his point is that no one said anything about it, but of course that does not a legal argument make.
A, they haven't been shown it. They don't know what to ask about. And B, it's not on the agenda. They can't talk about things that aren't on the agenda. So
yeah.
Anyway, I've done that. I've just then he's listed all these people. I've put in that he had no power under the charter to even permit this Russian representative to speak. As soon as the USSR was off the scene, its representative lost all authority, and he shouldn't have been allowed to speak.
And indeed, every time since
for
then,
the letters of credentials.
Every time that the Russians have spoken and even vetoed and voted at the United Nations, of course, that should not have had any effect. That is not legally binding or whatever.
It's a nullity. So it's as if Russia wasn't there, which it shouldn't have been. So, and he's saying, well, they met on the 6th of January. Well, nobody knows anything about what's going on. And then, so down the bottom of that screen, we've got the China resolution, which is directly on point. It's saying, you're not a member, your representatives are out. That's the bottom 3 lines. They're not throwing out China. They're not throwing out the Republic of China because the Republic of China isn't a member. They're throwing out its representatives because they're unlawfully there.
So what's this concerning with? Because we talked earlier about how China changed its name, but that's all fine because they're still the same kind of entity. But what's this talking about?
Okay, so this was when the People's Republic of China defeated the Republic of China. So we had the Communist Revolution from 1949. And in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of China that was deposed, went to the United Nations and said, I'm still the legitimate ruler of China in exile. So the United Nations supported him on that. They actually passed a resolution supporting him, saying that he was the legitimate leader and the PRC had to be gotten rid of. And then 22 years later, they passed a resolution saying that you're out, you're not China, your representatives have to go. So that is precisely what can be done with Russia. And time is nothing. It's either whether they're a member or whether they're not.
So that's a really important point to make, that there is precedent for coming back to this issue many, many moons later and then enforcing the proper procedures.
Yeah. There's no argument that anybody consented to Russia. They simply didn't know, and they still don't understand what the significance is of what happened. But with China, even if they had passed resolutions saying, we agree that Russia keeps you, sits on the Security Council, that resolution would be invalid. And it would not stop them from subsequently getting rid of Russia. Because you can't validate it. And then you've got the next one, which is Serbia, which was literally identical to Russia. So you had Serbia and Montenegro. Well, actually, it was a far stronger case than Russia. Both of these cases were far stronger cases than Russia. Russia hasn't got a leg to stand on. But with China, they had the argument that they'd been wrongly deposed, so they were still the government. Russia doesn't have that argument. And with Serbia and Montenegro, they actually still were in the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And all the others left, all the other states left, and they actually got the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia to sign a joint declaration saying that they were continuing its membership while they were still in it. And they said they were going to continue the membership of Yugoslavia just the same way that Russia said it was continuing the membership of USSR. Serbia and Montenegro. Well,
Yeah.
if you scroll halfway down, just a little, this is what the documentary pattern was for Serbia and Montenegro. Everything was circulated everywhere, and who it was circulated by. It was all circulated by the Secretary General, who was responsible. So, going back, it was discussed in numerous meetings, and eventually it was decided that despite the fact that Serbia and Montenegro were still in the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, it had ceased to exist. And therefore they could not continue its membership. So while the Republic of Yugoslavia actually arguably still existed, there was a declaration by the Security Council that it ceased to exist. And then the General Assembly passed that resolution saying you can't continue its membership, it ceased to exist.
So when pretty much an exact parallel of what's just happened with Russia, well, to some degree, took place, you had all of this official documentation and procedure, and then B, a kind of vote on this and a decision, or however it happened, a decision from the United Nations that actually, no, you cannot, there is no continuation here. There's no continuing of the Socialist Federal Republic or the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So that
they
then
have to apply for membership
separately. Yeah, exactly.
It's absolutely conclusive, and he's missed those cases out.
Wow. So what we have done today so far, and we'll just bring this to a conclusion, and then by talking about, okay, what needs to happen now. We have looked at how this was brought up by Ukraine previously, but it's been brought up by a number of people, yourself included, that actually Russia do not have a right to be on or they've not legally followed the correct procedure to have their membership of the UN, let alone their permanent membership of the Security Council. And there are legal experts such as Larry D. Johnson, who, in their capacity as a legal expert within the UN, have presented these arguments against this kind of position to suggest that actually Russia should be able to continue their playing their role in the UN as is and on the Security Council. And then you have looked back at these arguments and found them incredibly poor and very much wanting. And so we are back to the original position that we talked about a year ago. That is that Russia isn't entitled to their position in the UN and on the Security Council in the UN. So then the question is, okay, so you have a petition that you have started to try and get some momentum going for people to be aware of this predicament. And the next question is obviously, okay, what can be done about it, and how easy is it for that to be enacted?
Okay, it is super simple. All it requires, and I've drafted the resolution, which sets out the facts, and it's just a no-brainer. All that is needed is for one country or possibly two to table that resolution. Now, there is, at the moment, there is a emergency special session for Ukraine where it can be reconvened by as few as two, possibly one, I don't know, but the last one was reconvened on the request of two members. They asked for it to be reconvened, they tabled this resolution, they asked for a vote. any country looking at this resolution will immediately see what a pack of lies they have been told, and that I mean, this is how complicated it is. It's basically set out in 2 paragraphs.
And so what then would
And so
need to happen?
so strategically, logistically, so what happens is this gets tabled, the newspapers get hold of it, it's going to hit world headlines because Russia does not have a leg to stand on. There is no debate about it. It only requires a simple majority, as you can see at the top, and it can't be vetoed. It doesn't go to the Security Council, the same as the Chinese one did not go to the Security Council. The Security Council only decides on admission of members. They don't decide on chucking out trespassers.
The opposite. Yeah.
They don't decide on chucking out trespassers. They've got their jurisdiction is set out in Articles 4 to 6 and 24, and I think there's like one other article as well which I came across, but doesn't cover this. So it goes to the General Assembly, and so you've got the 143 countries that support Ukraine, including, for example, Yemen, who thought Ukraine was going to be their savior and turn the United Nations back into an organization that would actually protect countries. Unfortunately, they've just, so many of those countries have been realized that Ukraine doesn't care about them, they only care about themselves, so they've kind of slipped off. But what happens is that there's 143 countries that were prepared to vote against Russia. Then there was 5 that were prepared to vote for Russia. That was 2.4% of the United Nations membership that actually supported Russia. The ones in between were most likely countries that were under pressure from Russia, but still refused to support it. Okay, that is very, very significant, that even when being pressured by Russia, they still refuse to support Russia, because when that's their escape opportunity. If that resolution is passed, Putin immediately loses all his international power. He can't go and invade countries and stop the UN from doing anything about it. So that's their ticket to freedom. And I'd be willing to bet that that resolution will be passed almost unanimously. And those countries that have been abstaining because they're scared of Russia will be lining up to go in and help Ukraine as UN forces.
So the question then is,
politically,
if it is so simple, which I don't deny it is, right? Not practically, in the abstract sense, like that is conceivably a simple thing to do, right? Why has that not taken place?
Because nobody believes that can be done. Everybody's been told that Russia has a veto and it will veto anything, and it is impossible. Everybody is absolutely convinced of this. This is what I have come up against time and time and time again. What's happened is that I've counted 21 previous petitions which have all said for Russia to be kicked out on the basis that Russia is in there and Russia has a veto. So they've all been asking for the impossible. So people have now got to the point where they've torn their hair out and said, this is ridiculous. It has been deliberately discredited, and people have been put off this by seeding petitions which can't work. So governments won't even listen to you. They won't even read things that say kick Russia out of the UN, because they're expecting an impossible so they're expecting a stupid, impossible demand. You've got to kick Russia out of the UN, expel Russia, even though it's not in the UN, which I pointed out the logistical fallacy of that at the outset. But that is literally how simple it is. And
So
it would take a week. It would take a week, Jonathan, to pass this.
So realistically, what you want is traction
And Russia's
with
gone.
You want traction with the petition and articles to be written in newspapers. You would really need this to kind of catch the public's attention.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk through on the change.org page, you talk through what the problem is, everything we talked about today, what demand is, what it will achieve, as you set out, what an example of the resolution might be, what we can do, how it happened. The United Nations is violating its own charter, and then you've got an FAQ trying to answer all the issues pertaining to this subject. So there's a very detailed change.org petition page. So let's try and get some traction with that as an audience. But it seems to me that it is a bit of an open and closed book. This, like you say, it's really, it's obvious that Russia have not done things properly, and that they shouldn't have that membership of the UN. They didn't follow the correct procedures, and therefore it's not kind of legally justified that they are in the position they're in, and they've made the votes they have, and they've been vetoing stuff on the Security Council. So I think that's perfectly obvious, and it's interesting when you then look at what should be the biggest, most robust argument against your position by Larry Johnson here, and we've only kind of skimmed through the criticisms you've got of this piece, but there's far more detail in your Substacks. That actually the very best argument just falls apart under just the merest of scrutiny. Is there anything else you want to add to that? Anything else you think needs to be said?
One thing I would really like is for pressure to be put on influencers. You are the only person who has actually been open-minded enough and intelligent enough, if I may say so, to actually just sit down and look at this and listen to me. I have approached so many who just have ghosted me, and one or two have abused me. And, all these are pro-Ukraine people. The other aspect of this is that being on the United Nations gives Putin his disinformation megaphone. He is he is stopping the world from stopping disinformation. He is feeding the toxic right through the world, and particularly in America, India, UK, everywhere.
Europe.
And that is his microphone. He's working in tandem with others because they're all after the same thing. They're after dividing up the world, as somebody so eloquently put it today in something that I saw, which is absolutely blunt. Trump doesn't want to sort out Ukraine. He wants to divide up the world with Xi and
this
and
is
Putin.
it. It's the modern empires.
It's the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Yeah.
And this is what Russia's been quietly sitting there since Yeltsin's days, when Yeltsin tried to get Clinton to agree to it. He was saying, just give Europe to Russia. You can have the rest of the world. We want Russia. He was absolutely adamant. This goes on for about 2 pages in the Clinton record. And Putin's now finally maneuvered a president into place that will do that will give them what they want. Now, if we want the world divided up, fine, don't look at the petition, don't bother thinking about this. But this is really, really fundamental and critical. This is credibility, and it is physical power, which allows Russia to exploit Africa, to spread corruption, to sponsor places. He cuts off support to Sudan, where he is getting 77% of their gold exports in payment from their mines, in payment for the protection from forces that he is sponsoring, that will instantly stop once the United Nations. So he's preventing the United Nations from acting on these things. He's preventing the United Nations from helping countries. He's preventing the United Nations from walking into Palestine and Israel and saying, right, leave it with us. We will get Hamas. We will sort it out. This
When you
is
have
the
a
United
villain,
Nations job.
when you have a villain with a veto, like that's what it is, a villain with a veto sitting on a decision-making council for all the nations of the world, then it's giving permission. Russia is able to just give themselves permission to wreak havoc and do all of the bad things they're doing. It's just absolutely incredible that they are still able to do what they're doing without any comeback. And so this is the first step towards, righting that wrong and rebalancing the United Nations in a more favourable way for decency and democracy.
Yeah.
Well, look, thank you so much for coming on. Hopefully that has been of interest to the audience. We have dissected, sometimes in the minutiae, some of these arguments and the language used by people trying to defend Russia's position in the UN, or at least defend the status quo. And I think that is not right. And this is an important discussion. This is an important topic. And if wouldn't it be wonderful if this platform that Russia is able to have is taken away? If we can remove Russia from the UN, that would be absolutely fantastic, from the Security Council particularly. Okay, well, look, thank you so much, Talaria. People can find you obviously at your Substack, which is Knowledge is Power. And my goodness, the work you've done is incredibly detailed. Just this one article that we've been going through, and we didn't go through all of it, on Larry Johnson's own article is just massive, right? And detailed. It's almost overwhelming the amount of detail you are able to collate here with all of your pieces. I mean, just the images article Substack here is for what we've just been talking about is just, I mean, look how incredibly long and detailed it is. So the work you've done is incredible. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's actually necessary, unfortunately. I don't want to do it, but every single thing I have written in there is something that somebody has said that's not true. There's no other reason for it. One last thing I wanted to say was nobody can figure out really what Putin's motive is for being so hell-bent on destroying Ukraine that he's throwing away his own economy, destroying his own demography, and digging himself into a hole. All you need to do is look at the timing. The first challenge by Ukraine to Russia's position in the United Nations was coming up just before the invasion. That, I believe, is what triggered the invasion. And that is the only thing to make Putin desperate enough that he absolutely has to get rid of Ukraine's government, because they were threatening his world hegemony, or hegemony. I prefer to say hegemony. It sounds really surprising until you actually look at how these articles started coming out, challenging it. Now, no country is really going to bother doing anything about that except Ukraine. And that is why 2 weeks after he invaded, Putin demanded that Zelensky had to go personally, because Zelensky, it's nothing to do with this success of successful democracies. Russia is surrounded by successful democracies. It's nothing to do with resources. Russia is throwing away its resources to get something else. It is Putin's world hegemony that is at stake, and that is existential. That is the existential threat to Russia. It's not something that anybody else mentioned. It's sticking out like dog's balls, if you'll excuse the New Zealand term, to me. There is no, it matches up perfectly the sense of absolute panic and desperation, this desperate need for Putin to take control of the Ukrainian government. That it's the only thing that explains it. So have a think on that. But that is bigger than resources. It's bigger than that. That's Africa. That's South America.
Yeah.
That's his hopes for Europe. That's his hope for Europe. So,
well, look, thank you for these. Yeah, for so much to think about. Really appreciate that. And everyone can find Talaria at her Substack, Knowledge is Power, which will be in the details to the video below. For the meantime, stay on the line, Talaria, and I will end this recording. But thank you very much for the work you've done. And let's try and get behind that petition and see if we can make our own impact on this very important topic. So thanks, Talaria.
Thank you.